restriction.
So this is our presentation on the effectiveness of water restrictions. It's by me, Noah, and Alex. So for starters, a little bit of background info. The Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, or Mass DEP, is responsible for monitoring water use between like public suppliers in Mass. After the Water Management Act in 1986, there are two different types of water users. The first of which is registered. Registered users are those who were established prior to the latest registration date of January 4th in 1988. These are really hard for Massachusetts, like Mass DEP, to regulate. Permanent users are those who came after that January 4th date. They typically are reevaluated every 10 years to see if there needs to be any changes to the permit or anything like that. And these are subject to greater restrictions, which helps to regulate water and prevent overconsumption. The big consideration for Mass DEP is whether or not the MWRA, which is the Massachusetts Water Resource Authority, should be regulated. The MWRA is the supplier for Boston and 43 towns on the east side of Mass. And in order to help us look into this, Massachusetts DEP gave us gold star towns, which are towns that implemented restrictions effectively. So in order to look at this, we decided on three main research questions to look at. We focus on like, are water bans and water restrictions effective? What are the benefits of implementing them, and why do they work? These three questions help us prove whether or not it's worthwhile to put these restrictions in place for the MWRA.
So the data we used, we were given ASR data from Mass DEP, which is provided by the Water Management Act for public water suppliers. The ASR data that they gave us looked at population, percent residential, basin regions, and surface water for each town. We also received Mass GIS data, which summarized the land use for each town. Then the US Census Bureau Quick Facts gave us the median income for each town. We used this data to find towns similar to Franklin, which was deemed a gold star town that our group chose. We sorted through the data and we had it, we tried to find towns similar numerically to Franklin. And once we decided upon Needham, Hingham, Natick, and Walpole, we created this parallel coordinate chart for the towns just to show like visually that these towns are similar across the six categories of data that we used. So for our methods, we chose our gold star town, which was Franklin, Mass. Then next we sorted the data to find similar towns, which we did. And then once we had that and we created the parallel coordinate chart to confirm the similarities, we plotted water use data to see the effect of water use restrictions. And these are shown in the following slides.
So yeah, it takes on the y-axis, you can see the net finished water normalized, and really the equation for net finished water normalized, right, is the net finished water from a town. So that's really the water that's ready for delivery to consumers. So it's that value in million gallons, and then you divide that by the population of the particular town, multiplied by the number of days in that specific month, because you can see on the x-axis we have months. So that's our really like a monthly average for RGPCD, or residential gallons per capita per day. So we can see right here the red lines, or the red plots in the graph for Needham and Natick is kind of like what we expected, right? So we have the two towns that aren't restricted towns having the higher values, but it's also, you can also see a pattern or an irregularity in that assumption when you look at Hingham starting in July and then going to September, where we can see Hingham having similar values to Natick. So it's really the question that we want to ask after looking at this graph is, why do we see that irregularity in a town that has restrictions like Hingham, and then in a town that isn't restricted like Natick? And another pattern that we see in the first graph is that Franklin, our gold star town, is having really low values, and obviously that's what we want to see, because this is the town that is supposed to have exemplary water conservation results according to Mass DEP. And so in the second graph, we did another graph. And this is showing the RGPC data that we had in the first graph, but we took the average of each town for the winter months. So the winter months were November to February, and we divided each monthly average divided by that winter average to sort of confirm our results from the first graph. So we can see that Needham has the higher values, like, okay, we expected that. But we also expected the gray line, Natick, to be higher as well. But we see that Hingham has higher values starting around May and then going to the end of the year. So it's kind of, that was a question that raised the question as to why we saw Hingham having those higher values. So again, we see that anomaly in the graph. And yeah, we can talk about that more in the results slide. So yeah, again, the results, we had like I was describing, the annual monthly RGPC data. And then we wanted to look at, which towns have restrictions versus non-restricted towns. So for us, out of our 5 towns, Franklin, our Gold Star town, and then Walpole and Hingham were 3 towns with restrictions. And then our 2 non-restricted towns were Needham and Natick, which, if you remember, were the red lines on the first graph. And then we also had towns with permits. So that was Franklin, Natick, and Walpole, and then registered towns, which was Needham and Hingham. And then it's just important to remember that, permit is Mass DEP mandated water restrictions. So towns with those permits, you would assume have lower RGPCD values, which is something that we really don't see with Natick, at least in the first graph. And then again, going back to that anomaly that we see in the second graph with Hingham having those higher values, we wanted to look at our town matching metrics that we used in the beginning with our parallel coordinate chart. We wanted to look at those metrics to see maybe which ones might, explain why Hingham has those higher values. And what we found was that in our percent green land cover, between Hingham and Natick, that Hingham had over 50% green land cover and Natick had under 30%. So that difference is what we saw in that could be helpful in explaining that that increase in Hingham's values for the winter graph, the second graph. Because, if they have a higher percent green land cover, they probably have bigger lawns. Their residents have bigger lawns, which might require more maintenance and, higher water use for those particular lawns. So, and then for our conclusion slide, really we're just saying, should restrictions be implemented, and like how they should be implemented and how, like, what are the specifications of those restrictions. So I think that both graphs show that Franklin has really effective and efficient mandates and, water restrictions. And because we see that Franklin has lower values for both graphs. And so for Franklin more specifically, their restriction was, their type was handheld watering only. And in how they implemented those restrictions was a calendar trigger in the permit. So for a specific time period throughout the year, they would have a water ban in effect. And another detail about their restriction was that they were able to use that handheld watering only 1 day a week. So they were pretty strict in their ban. And so, yeah, that's our presentation on water restriction effectiveness.